Like what we're doing here at Cube for Two? Click the like and subscribe button to let us know. Also, Cube for Two is now a TCG Player affiliate. Click the link in the show notes for all your shopping needs to help support the channel. Alright guys, let's get started. What's good, Cubers? It's your boy Matt, and I was looking through my cube recently and I realized how many cards I have just cut over the last year or so. Cards that used to be cube staples or considered like sacred cows that you never talked about cutting these cards, and lately I've been cutting a bunch of them for newer cards. The older cards haven't aged as well or whatever. So this week we're going to talk about sacred cows that maybe need to be put out to pasture. But before we get started, I do want to go ahead and put up front, cube size matters here. And if you're in a 720 cube, I'm not telling you that you have to cut all these cards. In fact, I'm not telling you to cut any of them. You look at the list, you look at the suggestions, and take from it the pieces that you think are relevant for your cube. Bigger cubes especially have density issues, and so they're probably still needing to play some of these cards. But if you're at 360, low 400s, then maybe it's time for you to reevaluate and see if all of these cards are still good for you and your cube environment. That said, let's get started with white and look at what was once considered to be a cube staple, and that's Sun Titan. For 4 and double white, you get a 6/6 vigilance. Whenever Sun Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So the floor on Sun Titan is that you get a 6/6 Vigilant for 6 mana and you whiff in your graveyard. And the upside is that maybe there's something in your graveyard to recur. I can just tell you from personal experience that I have just been less and less impressed with Sun Titan. My control decks see it as kind of a vanilla finisher, and it's too high up the curve for my aggro decks, which means that Sun Titan is basically a mid-range creature at 6 mana, which is not really where I want my mid-range at either. He's actually whiffed the last few times he came into play before I cut him a while ago. I feel this way about most of the Titans. I think everyone but Grave Titan is probably cuttable, at least worth reevaluating. Sun Titan just doesn't do it for me anymore. What I have wound up doing in my white section is continually lowering the curve, and I have better options, I feel like, at 5 mana with cards like Angel of Invention and Angel of Sanctions, which is a super underrated and very budget cube card. I like Angel of Invention for going wide and buffing my whole board. She fits the mid-range deck very well. She even can play in the aggro deck if it's wide with tokens. I like the Angel for its removal, and my control decks like the Angel of Sanctions better for that reason as well. Furthermore, when Sanctions dies, he draws you another copy of himself, which is something else I really like about the Angel of Sanctions. So, yeah, Sun Titan is just a little too much mana and not enough bang for your buck, as silly as that sounds. I know you're like, but Matt, I'm going to attack with him, I'm going to do the things, I'm going to recur lots of 3 mana permanents out of my graveyard. And I hear that, but most of the time what happens when I played Sun Titan is he came down, maybe he recurred something, and then he immediately died. So he just wasn't all that for me. He's also very chumpable. I'm a big fan of the evasion on the Angels, when the control decks like that as well. And if you're sitting at home and you're salty about my feelings on the Sun Titan, you might want to go ahead and click off this video, because I'm about to address another white staple, and that's Elspeth Knight Errant. For 2 and double white, you get an Elspeth with 4 loyalty, +1 make a 1/1 white soldier creature token, +1 target creature gets +3/+3 and gains flying, -8 you get an emblem, all your stuff's indestructible. So the problem with me for Elspeth is that she is no longer a top tier White Walker at 4 mana. Now if you're in a bigger cube, you're probably still playing her. Like I said, you've got density issues and you only can have so many good quality White Walkers, so you're playing her. But in smaller cubes, you gotta admit she's not as good as Gideon Ally of Zendikar, who's making 2/2 white Knight Ally creature tokens and is a 5/5 indestructible himself, and you can ultimate get the emblem the turn he comes down. She's nowhere near as strong as Sarah the Benevolent, who I have banned for power reasons, because it's so easy to get the worship emblem on her ultimate, and that is impossible to interact with. And I would say that she's not as good as the new Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis, who you can replay out of your yard over and over and makes tokens quicker. So for me, there's just not enough room for Elspeth Knight Errant in my cube anymore. I'm not saying that she's a bad card, and again, bigger cubes probably need to be playing her, but as best I can tell, new Elspeth is better, and that means that I just don't have room for Knight Errant in my cube anymore, and I've had to cut her. So maybe that's another card you look at, reevaluate. Sun's Nemesis has been gross. That card is stupid. So maybe reevaluate Elspeth. But let's move to blue, where I think there are several cards that some of you are going to agree with me on that these cards aren't cubable anymore. And the first one I want to bring up, brace yourselves, is Glenalindra Archmage. There's only one reason to still be playing Glenalindra in your cube, and that's if you're trying to support some kind of persist combo package, where you can just recur her over and over and just lock your opponent mostly out of the game. But if you're not playing a persist combo package, I don't like Glenalindra. She's a 4-mana 2/2. She dies to everything. She can't block. She doesn't slow down the aggro deck. She feels bad to cast in the control deck because you don't want to tap out on turn 4 to cast her. I have replaced her with what seems like an innocuous card, but it was so much better. I'm actually playtesting something else in its spot, but Murmuring Mystic could easily drop back in my cube. I was really impressed with this card. One, it came down and just stonewalled the aggro deck. They had to use 2 spells to get rid of it. And he's incidentally making you birds as you cantrip and counterspell your way through your deck. Blue has just gotten so many better options at 4 mana for smaller cubes. For example, you could be playing Sower of Temptation, which I love in a control deck. Stealing your opponent's threats and then slapping them around with it is great. Also at 4 mana, you could be playing cards like Venser's Shaper Savant, which is a fantastic tempo play, either bouncing a spell or a permanent back to your owner's hand and then chump blocking something else. Feels like a 2-for-1, it's great. And God Eternal Kefnet is another stat body that you don't mind tapping out to play him because he locks down the board when he hits. Your opponent really has to think twice before swinging in against God Eternal Kefnet. So Glenalindra is fine, but I don't think she is as good as any of the cards that I've mentioned. So if you're in a smaller cube and you're not supporting any kind of persist combo, Glenalindra just doesn't do it for me anymore. And now it's time to talk about something that I hear people typing on their keyboards right now. Ladies and gentlemen, it is probably time that we cut Muldrifter. Here's the thing. Muldrifter is 5 mana for a 2/2 flyer that lets you draw 2 cards when you come into play. And I hear some of you saying, but Matt, he's super flexible, I can evoke him. Here's the thing. 3 mana to draw 2 cards is not a great rate. We don't play Divination in cube. And to quote my boy Usman, when my opponent taps 5 mana in the blue deck and plays Muldrifter, I'm relieved. There are lots of more scary things he could be playing at 5 mana. In fact, the blue 5 slot in cube in the last year has changed dramatically because I have cut another Sacred Cow as well, and that's Maloku, who I used to love, who used to be a house, and now she's not. Blue has just gotten so gross in the 5-drop slot. So if you're thinking about playing Muldrifter, just don't. If you want a cantrip, play New Omen of the Sea instead. Don't like Omen of the Sea? Play one of the 5-drop beaters that's a bomb, like Tezzeret Artifice Master or Cavalier of Gales. When my opponents tap 5 mana in my cube, this is what I'm scared is coming down. At 5 mana, these guys say, I'm gonna win unless you answer me. And Muldrifter just doesn't, so the 5 mana mode on Muldrifter is always bad, which means that you're mostly hoping to cast him for his evoke cost, which is always at sorcery speed, and I don't like having to be a Jedi and read my opponent's mind knowing whether it's safe to cast it or not. If you're just going to cast him to draw the 2 cards, I suggest cutting him and just playing a cantrip in his spot instead. Sorry, Mully. Bye. Let's move on to black though and reevaluate what is a staple in Pioneer and what we used to play a lot of in Cube, and that's Kalitas, Trader of Get. Now, if you've seen this channel very much, you know that I am not a big fan of Kalitas. I don't like my 4-drops to fail the Vindicate test. So let's take a look at Kalitas. For 2 and double black, you get a legendary creature, 3/4 lifelinker. If a non-token creature your opponent controls would die, instead exile that card and put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. Pay 3, sacrifice a vampire or a zombie, and put 2+1/+1 counters on Lotus. And what I don't like about Lotus is that he's slow, and again, he flunks the Vindicate test. When you play Lotus, you have to hope something of your opponent's dies soon so that you can make the token, so that then you can sink the mana into him to make the counters. And again, he doesn't have any evasion, it's just lifelink, so Lotus just doesn't do it for me. As a matter of fact, if you're thinking, well, Matt, I could play him and then kill something of my opponent's immediately, that makes him a 6-drop because you're casting some kind of spell or something afterwards. Like, I just don't like Lotus. Instead, my new favorite 4-drop, y'all know it, it's Rankle. Rankle is gross. This card is so good. Flying. Haste. He's got 3 different modes on him, and you can do any one that is relevant or all of them. I love me some Rankle. He's the king of the black 4s. Followed closely by cards like Ravenous Chupacabra or Skin Render. Chupacabra's just better, but still I like Chups. With some creature removal on a body. I would even rather play something more fun than Lotus, like Gonti, because at least Gonti passes the Vindicate test. I get to look and steal a card off my opponent's deck, and Death Touch isn't nothing. So all of these 4-drops I like way better than Lotus, who is, again, he's just slow. You just have to play him and hope that some stuff dies, and then maybe you can sink some mana into him to grow him, and then he just gets jumped or dies to removal. I don't know. Lotus just doesn't do it for me. And since we're on the subject of talking about popular black cards that I don't think cut it anymore, let's talk about Tasigur the Golden Fang. So Tasigur is 6 mana for a 4/5 with Delve, and that's something. For 2 and Hybrid Simic, you can put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard and then return a non-land card of your opponent's choice from your graveyard to your hand. And what I don't like about Tasigur is that he's slow. He's not actually a 6 mana spell. Most of the time you're going to delve him in to at 4 mana or so. But again, the thing I don't like about him is that he's slow. If you're not in a Dimir deck or a Golgari deck, you can't even use his bottom ability, which just makes him a 4/5 with Delve. And if you can use his ability, you have to sink 4 mana into him every turn, hoping to mill something good in your graveyard that you can return to your hand and then hopefully have enough mana to cast. Tasigur is most likely to end up in some kind of control deck that's going to have the time to dirtle about and use his bottom ability. And if he's in a control deck, I would argue that there are better black 6-drops that you could play as finishers in your control deck. Like Grave Titan. Okay, we won't talk about Grave Titan. Grave Titan's better than everything. Let's talk about some other cards. Maybe Noxious Gearhulk, which is super sweet. Removal on a body. Menace gains you life, which is really relevant in the control deck. Even Liliana Dreadhorde, making zombies or emptying the board, drawing you cards. These cards are way more impactful and way scarier than Tasigur. It's time to let Tasigur go. Shard cards don't really have a place in Cube. I don't think you play Tasigur even at larger cube sizes. Maybe that's just me, maybe you're upset at the house and that's cool. Play Tasigur, make your playgroup happy. But for me, I just found him really slow and dirtily, and there are more effective options in black. But let's move to red and talk about a red board wipe that used to be played everywhere, and thankfully, increasingly more and more, I see it cut from cubes, and that's Mizzium Mortars. For 1 and a red, you get a sorcery. Mizzium Mortars deals 4 damage to target creature you don't control. You can overload it for 3 and triple red to do that to each creature you don't control. So this is our red board wipe that is optional as spot removal. And the thing that I think makes this card cuttable is that we've gotten so many good board wipes in other colors, particularly white. If we ignore Wrath of God and Day of Judgment, we could still be playing Shatter the Sky, Settle the Wreckage, Fumigate. And I realize that you're at the house thinking, Matt, all of these are in white, Mizzium Mortars is red. I hear that, but Mizzium Mortars is kind of a sneaky card, because most of the time it's gonna see play in a control deck. After all, red aggro decks want to be able to go face with their burn, and control decks are hoping to overload this card. The secret about Mizzium Mortars is that since it mostly wants to be in a control deck, that means you're in a 3-color control deck, because most of the time control decks are Azurius or Dimir, and they'll splash that red to go Grixis or Jeskai. and triple red is a big deal in those decks. Plus, we just got a new board wipe in Theros that does the same thing, and that's Storm's Wrath, and not only does it deal 4 damage to each creature, it also hits your opponent's planeswalkers as well. Let's be honest, the control deck doesn't really care about nuking its own creatures because it's barely playing any, it's mostly playing walkers. So Storm's Wrath is probably just a better and more consistent board wipe. Now, if you play this card, if you play Mortars in your cube and find yourself almost always using it as spot removal and never overloading it, in that case, I just think you cut it for some kind of generic burn spell. Far more decks will want just a generic lightning strike, incendiary flow kind of effect than a Mizzium Mortars that deals 4 damage to a creature. So I would much rather play either of the 2 cards on the right than Mizzium Mortars, who I found pretty much never got overloaded and only really saw play in control decks that were hoping to overload it. So Mizzium Mortars, just not for me. I don't think it's a good enough board wipe for us anymore, and I don't think it's a good enough spot removal spell either. So, too much mana, can't go face with it. I think we're done with Mizzium Mortars. Let's press on to green though, and there's a card or two that I'd really like to talk about. And John, what are you saying? Stop subtweeting green 4s. John, I would never talk about green 4s. I would never bash traditional cube green 4s and suggest that maybe you cut all of them for some other more impactful green 4s. I wouldn't do that. Not that I talked about it in a Unga Bunga video last week or anything. We're not going to talk about green 4s today though. Instead, what I do want to talk about is 3 mana ramp spells, which I am just off completely. All of them. Cut them all. Kodama's Reach, Cultivate, Yavmaya Elder. People play these cards in cube all the time, and 3 mana ramp just doesn't do it for me anymore. I would much rather have 2 mana dorks in my hand than a mana dork and a cultivate. I just would. It lets your deck be faster and double spell more in the early turns and ramp a little harder. I would cut all the 3 mana ramp. I would go down to 2 mana ramp. We've gotten so much good 2 mana ramp. Look at this. Paradise Druid, Devoted Druid, Sylvan Caryatid, Wall of Roots. It's all much better than Cultivate because you can do it more effectively and more consistently. You could even play other cards, Farseek, Fertile Ground, Rampant Growth, Wolf Willow Haven. There is no need to play 3 mana ramp in cube anymore. We've gotten so many quality 2-drops. You could even scale back to the 1-drops that you're not playing. You just don't want to be playing 3 mana ramp spells in your cube. I promise you, cut out all the 3 mana ramp and scale it back to 1 and 2 mana ramp, your green section is going to play so much better. It's going to be so much faster, so much more explosive. It's just time to let all the 3 mana ramp spells go. Speaking of ramp, let's talk about a cube sacred cow that it's time to cut the head off of this snake, and that's Lotus Cobra. The thing about Lotus Cobra is people love his interaction with fetch lands, and I understand that. I play 14 different lands in my cube, 10 fetches and 5 cards like Prismatic Vista, Fatal Passage, etc. that interact really well with Lotus Cobra, and we still find it underwhelming. Most of the time, Lotus Cobra sits there and you get 1 land drop and he makes 1 mana, which makes him no better than any other 2 mana dork, and sometimes you don't have a land to play with him, and so he doesn't make any mana. And other times I've had players holding a land in their hand so that they can trigger Lotus Cobra, which means they're deliberately missing land drops for him. The fact of the matter is there just aren't enough ways to consistently trigger him, and missing him or being unable to cast your 5-drop because you didn't top deck a land feels horrible. Did I mention there's a whole lot of really other good stuff at 2 mana in green to help you ramp with? If you're trying to support some kind of lands matter deck, I understand your predilection towards playing Lotus Cobra. But the only way I would play Lotus Cobra is if I was supporting a lands deck at 360 or the low 400s and I was like doubled up on my fetches. I would much rather have a card like Paradise Druid, Sylvan Caryatid, or Wall of Roots that are harder to remove, and Wall of Roots and Sylvan Caryatid can even block. All the ramp spells on the right are almost impossible to have bolted out or removed out from under you. So Lotus Cobra for me, he just doesn't cut the mustard anymore. He's been cut out of our cube for a while now, and we really don't miss him. But let's move on to our colorless section and talk about something a little more nitpicky, and I understand if you don't want to make this change. One of the things that people have been doing a lot with their cube lately is cutting cards like Is It Signet and replacing them with cards like Talisman of Creativity. I'm not telling you this is something you have to do. I do think the talismans are objectively stronger, especially in powered environments, because you can play them and then immediately tap them to move into larger plays on turns 2 and 3 and the early turns where it matters. So I think that's a big deal in powered cubes. I think you definitely move to the talisman cycle, but the signets are still fine. I think the difference is pretty negligible. I actually like the fact that the talismans cost you life to use. I feel like it helps out the aggro deck a little bit and punishes those control decks and ramp decks that are playing these cards too cheap on mana. I like the idea of punishing them. Furthermore, the talismans can serve as just generic mind stones. So I do think there is upside to playing the talismans over the signets, and this is a sacred cow that we probably can put out to pasture unless your cube is gigantic, in which case maybe you play a full set of all of them. But in smaller cubes especially, I think you cut these. In fact, in my cube, I only play 3 of the 10 talismans. I only play them in my control colors because I don't want the control players snatching up off-color talismans just to help them ramp harder. And I don't like fixing outside of green if I can help it. I want people to splash green. That's part of its identity in the color cycle, the color wheel. But that's a whole nother discussion. Like I said, I do think talismans are a step up from signets, but this is a sacred cow that if you don't want to make the jump yet, I understand. The signets aren't that far off the talismans. The difference is negligible in most situations. Still, there are some sacred cows in the colorless section that I notice more and more cubers are cutting out of their cubes. And so let's take a minute and talk about people cutting swords out of their cubes. More and more I see swords getting cut from cubes, and I understand why. And the big reason is at the top and bottom of the card, and that's the equip cost and the mana cost. A sword costs 5 mana to put down. If you play it on turn 3 in an aggressive deck, you're taking a very important turn off from buffing and swinging in at your opponent because you can't play the sword and immediately equip it. Otherwise, you'd be playing cards like Grafted War Gear, which I like much better because I can play Grafted War Gear on turn 3 and then equip it to my Goblin Guide and immediately get in with it, which is not something you can do with a sword. Equip costs are very real downsides on equipments. I get that the swords are really good. I'm not arguing that the sword is bad. But having to pay the mana to put it onto a creature in aggressive decks can sometimes time walk you, only to have your creature get removed because the sword you're equipping doesn't provide the relevant protection. Speaking of protection, that is another reason why people are removing swords from cube, is that they find the mechanic of protection to be too polarizing. The idea that you're in the Is It deck, I just equipped Fire and Ice, and now I have protection from your deck, is a big downside for the Is It player. And so sometimes a sword can turn into a, oops, I win card. This is another reason why cubers are cutting the swords from their cube. But there is actually one other reason, and most of the time Modern Horizons brings us gross stuff, but I think in this case, Modern Horizons has actually caused some people to start cutting swords from their cube, and that is that they have added more swords to the cycle, and players don't want to play all the swords. You don't want to give 7 artifact slots up in your colorless section if your cube is small. I mean, if you're playing 10 signets and 7 swords, that's most of your colorless section right there. And so one of the things I have found people doing is playing more flexible equipment, or equipment that equips at a lower equip cost, or equipment that is less polarizing, rather than trying to play all the different swords. I'm not telling you that you have to cut these. They are very good. I'm not a big fan of paying 3 to drop it and then 2 the next turn to equip it, or trying to pay 5 mana to drop and equip in one turn. It just feels like a lot of mana to me. That's the reason that I'm off them. But it is something that you might reevaluate for your cube. That's going to do it for today, cubers. I hope that you take away from today's video not that you have to cut all these cards, but rather that maybe it's time to reevaluate and look at cards that you thought were uncuttable and see if they really are, especially if you're in a smaller cube. I'm really trying to just give you some food for thought and make you reevaluate cards that maybe you wouldn't have done otherwise. If you have suggestions for cards that you think deserve a second look or maybe need to be re-examined in terms of how good they are foreign cube. Maybe people think it's a sacred cow and you don't. Go ahead and drop me a line in the comments below. Also, if you've got ideas for videos or cards you'd like us to examine, go ahead and leave those down in the comments. I always read them, even if I can't get to everything. I always read them and I try to always reply. You can always catch me on Twitter at Cube42. Like and subscribe, ring that little bell in the corner, do all the things, and as always and until next time, shuffle up and keep cubing, my friends.